Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
This is August 4th, 2020, and we're on episode 73, The Great Commission. I don't know how to pronounce dollar signs.
Ka-ching. You have to have a little
Great
sound.
ka-ching ka-ching shin. I don't know. Doesn't work.
So this is a follow-up from yesterday. We got a number of folks towards the end asking us to say some more about mission, co-mission, dollar mission.
The mission
That's what we're
industrial
doing.
complex. Yeah.
Yes, the mission industrial complex. So,
Which
hey, Alan.
is, it's a huge topic, and it's one of those things. It's like there are a few things more sacred to certain subsets of Christianity than mission.
Yes.
It's evangelicalism. It's baked into the name.
Yeah.
It's like they're the gospel preachers. And so this idea of there being too much economic and political stuff tied up with that mission is almost anathema to talk about. But here we are.
So I feel like we need to go back and talk a little bit about what establishment is, because we have the establishment clause in the Constitution, and
go for it.
Which says that the government shall not establish religion, and so what that refers to isn't just like building a church on the town square, but that has to do with the king granting churches, orders, land, and access to resources to build their stuff. And if you want to read a great book about this, it's a novel, but it really shows us in great detail. The novel Pillars of the Earth, which is about building a cathedral in England.
There's also a mini-series about it based on that.
Yep, it was a mini-series that was really pretty decent. But the book does a great job of showing how, under this idea of divine right of kings, the king owns all the property. And so if you want to build a cathedral and you need a bunch of stone, you need to get permission from the king to quarry that stone. You can't just, go into the wilderness and find some stone. And so the church would establish, the king would establish a church or a monastery and say, you get this property, you get to cut down some trees, you get to dig some stone, you get to farm, you get to charge rents to make a living. And so the idea of the Establishment Clause with the United States was that of course gives a great deal of preference to one particular church over another, to one order over another. And then of course with the Reformation, where now you've got all these different Christian denominations and Christian bodies, the idea was they wanted to do away with this notion of establishment. Which then meant that you had to figure out how to raise your own money because you couldn't appeal to the king to give you a bunch of land and charge rents and get wood from the forest for free. Right. So at this point in America, then churches become really caught up with relating to the dominant economic model to raise money.
And this, incidentally, is there are all sorts of different schools of thought about where consumer capitalism comes from, specifically consumer capitalism. And a lot of people say, well, yes, you have proto-capitalism before this, but it's American revivalism is where you see the advent of what we think of as modern capitalism. I don't necessarily agree with that, but I think there's cases to be made because this is really where the birth of what we think of as modern sales and branding comes from like even snake oil salesmen, we think, oh yeah, maybe that's where it started. They're also ripping off this sort of revivalistic tendency. So this capitalism and this way that we think about evangelism happening today have been in bed together for a while.
Yeah. We've got a couple comments.
So Ellen writes, missions are how certain people get to go to neat places in the world. Don't mess. Sorry, Ellen. We're going to make it.
Sorry, Ellen.
I know how much you love your global travel.
Yes.
Chester writes, I'd love an episode like this, but in relation to the mainline liberal churches. Oh, we're going to get there.
We're going to get there.
We're not just ripping on evangelicalism as though liberals don't have their weird condescending bullshit. Something like how they serve as a spiritual supplement or support for a democratic bourgeois ethos. We'll dig into that.
Yeah, so let's just jump right ahead. So then what starts to happen, right, as churches begin to raise money and create their own establishments, right? So now you have to have your own establishment. And what's interesting is that this gets going really early in the colonies, right? So each colony became associated with a particular denomination. So you've got, the Episcopal Church in Virginia, the Presbyterian Church in Pennsylvania, you've got the Congregationalists in Massachusetts,
Quakers in Pennsylvania,
the Quakers in Pennsylvania, and so in a way, this becomes sort of a default kind of establishment. Right? It's not officially sanctioned by the government per se, but you get all the various landed folks that are connected to these particular churches. And of course, they need to give to their churches to get them going because, the government isn't giving to them.
Mm-hmm.
And then what happens, right, is that you then also get the impulse to spread the gospel, right, to evangelize. And so now you need, money to do that. And you start to develop, of course, the whole charity model, right? And a lot of these houses, the poorhouse, right, which had been getting rolling in Europe and England, that comes to America. And churches start to establish these houses for people. And it's kind of the early social services. And so whether you're conservative or liberal, this notion of, giving away a portion to charity very much becomes part of the ethos of the church. But the fundamental question of how are we making this money and how are we organizing our economic system never really gets questioned within any of these because, everybody's like gung ho, let's make a fortune in the new world.
Ellen writes, the nearest corner of town constantly has missions fundraisers of pit chicken, which is barbecue smoked. Yeah. The whole neighborhood smells of their missions trips every weekend. Mission smell. No, so like you have everything from, just talk about the economics from the bottom up. You have small rural churches like mine where we'd have, we did a theater, dinner theater in the church, and all the people in the church would volunteer to help come up with costumes and stuff to raise money so we could go to Mexico to evangelize people. But it was largely an experience for us, up to like missionaries who are part of like international missions who'd come and go to church and fundraise to go there to spread the gospel to them, without really even at that time like thinking about the impact of that. And so it's easy to make fun of the people who are like, remember that dude who went to the island that he wasn't supposed to and got killed? Remember that? It was like a year ago, back in the before time.
In the before times.
And so he died, and then you had this split, like all the people saying that dumbass should have stayed home. A lot of people saying, well, it's tragedy all around. And then some people saying like he is a martyr for Jesus. It's easy to point at that, but we also need to look at things that are closer to the Gates Foundation way of thinking about things, where you have lots of mainline money going to do development work in a capitalist mode. And so that's larger scale. And we're talking about lots of fundraising activity that's tied into politics and all sorts of stuff to send money and people to help prosper another place. And so we might not, mainliners know that it's crude and crass to try to get people to accept Jesus in order to receive those things. But instead, we're still tying up neoliberal ideological stuff in with that. And so it's still the gospel. It's just a different understanding of the gospel that's going there.
Right.
It's all
money
tied into that.
Yeah, one of the best examples of that I saw just a couple of years ago at an alternative medicine conference was this woman who runs this little rural clinic in Nicaragua. She had a photograph of this room full of broken medical equipment that all of these mission trip folks had brought to her clinic, trying to help her clinic, bringing all of their, at the time, almost broken equipment, extra equipment. There's no infrastructure for this kind of equipment in Nicaragua, and so it gets used once or twice, it breaks, there's no way to fix it, there's no way to get parts, right? And it's completely disconnected from any sort of indigenous healing, indigenous economy, anything that makes sense in that environment. And this woman who's given the presentation is like, this shit is worthless. Like, don't come down here and bring your medical garbage so that I have to put it in this room. Like, you'd be much better off just mailing me a check and not coming on the trip at all. And we see this happens all the time in terms of development work. It's often very expensive equipment that doesn't match what's going on there. It profits somebody else somewhere else who got paid for the equipment. In a very short period of time, it breaks, and then it's just this useless piece of junk sitting there, and you haven't helped anyone.
Kyle, I would like some more context on this. I'll get saved several times this summer.
On the trips. He'll go on these trips and get saved. Yeah. Not with the pandemic, he won't. Well.
Is Space Force related to mission somehow? Because Dan Shirt had me thinking of this. Dan's you got to do a commercial for the game.
Yeah, so this is the game Astroneer. It's the game my son makes. It's an awesome game, really fun. You can build your space base. Sure, Space Force is related to this. I mean, it's all about imperialism, right? We are going to take over, and the imperial church has been connected with this for about 1600 years, and it goes where the army goes, and is very connected then economically to the power of that.
Yeah, so it is telling that mission is a military word.
To go on a mission.
And Ellen Ritz, when I was a kid, when I heard the story of Jim and Betty Elliott, Paul Udarian, the others who are, the Motilone tribe, whatever, the tribal group that martyred these missionaries, like at Northwestern College, where I went for my undergrad, they have a lounge called Udarian Lounge, which is named after one of these martyrs. So this martyrdom piece is huge. I want to add just an angle to this, like within the kind of conversations around the carceral system, which is a better term for the criminal justice system. There's talk about soft policing, which are those activities that the police do to show their presence without being forceful in their enforcement, right? So it's like playing basketball with neighborhood kids. And it's known that a lot of nonprofits function as arms for soft policing. It's like the ones that help at-risk youth. So a lot of these sorts of programs that are kind of helpful work with the police and create this soft policing relationship and have like strong relationships with police. A lot of churches function this way, and it functions as, in some ways, an enforcement arm. That's what happens with missions. It's just on the global scale, they're soft imperialism. They work with the United States government a lot of times. They're working with larger businesses. And so what they do is they're softening the field a little bit, or they're working in concert. And they don't question it because, America's good and we're a force for freedom. So it's not bad to work with us in their thinking. And even though I'm in some other country, how is this anything bad? But it's soft imperialism. Max shares a link. I see the South Park in there. So I'm assuming that those of you reading along on Facebook who can maybe see that. Ceres writes, with all this, how do we create giving, receiving, and support each other that is neither colonial white savior nonsense nor romanticizing self-flagellation and downward mobility? That's a good question. What does mutuality and solidarity look like?
Yeah. And, I think that in a lot of ways, right, this is sort of the question of the just society. And, to me, when we look at any spiritual tradition has economic imperatives that are associated with this. And what pretty much all of them say in one way or another is what's just is that if everybody gets their basic needs met and takes care of each other, and then everybody has the space to contribute and do their thing. I mean, it really, in some ways, it really is very, very straightforward. The problem is that it really has never been done. I think we romanticize ancient tribal society and say that it's been done there. I'm not sure we have a tremendous amount of evidence for that, but but this is the point, right, of the Jubilee year in the Hebrew Bible, right, where any unequitable distributions of wealth all get redistributed, and everybody starts over. Everybody gets their land back, and so I think that this is where the self-reflection piece comes in. I mean, if we are the privileged ones, right? So if the folks in the mainline liberal church who are all, the mainline liberal church is above average wealthy, statistically, you don't really start by, going to poor people and, as Julia said yesterday, giving them some crumbs. You start by figuring out, like, how can you redistribute the excess that you have?
A lot of it has to do with having a power analysis. So I'm just going to pick on the Mennonite church, partly because it's the group I know best. And also because Mennonites tend to be, people assume that they're super ethical. So Mennonites traditionally had mutual aid societies that have morphed into investment companies. So that's happened with almost every mutual aid society by church. Mm-hmm. And that was for themselves. And then they had missions agencies for people of color. To this day, if you're a Mennonite, if you're a Latin American Mennonite and you're reaching out mostly to other Latin Americans, you tend to fall into their missions category. So it's built in, the sense of mutuality and power. One is the recipients, and the others who are the ones who care for each other. So to me, part of it is broadening that so that there's mutual aid, that the way in which the people who have excess don't have power over the people who have less. I mean, that has to do with every power and privilege dynamic. It's the same question as how do white men support people in the struggle for racial justice or gender justice? Well, we have to, but we also recognize we have extra power, and so we can ruin things. So that dynamic, I think, is everywhere there's any sort of relationality where we're struggling to do the right thing. We're going to have to grapple with that question. And with Christian missions, it's particularly problematic because Christian supremacy is real, American capitalism is powerful, and that veneer of altruism hides all sorts of disgusting, coercive things, and we need to be able to peer underneath it without getting defensive as shit, which is what happens when you talk to churches about, hey, how are you spending your money?
Right.
Yeah.
Yep. All right, we've got great comments rolling in.
Kathleen writes, I once served a church whose big mission project was to make candles out of empty tuna cans. Why tuna? That would be a smelly candle. I don't know how you wash it out sufficiently for the homeless to warm their hands. What about addressing the root cause?
Oh my God. There's so many painful things about that.
Oh, that's like a really bad episode of a Dickensian
exactly.
adaptation of those.
It's
so ridiculous.
Charles Dickens novel.
But even now, like, I got to imagine there's somebody watching. It's like, you guys are so cynical. At least those homeless people have warm hands. Anything helps. Then that sort of logic, that's sort of like, well, anything helps logic is also part of the problem, because there's actual harm that happens when you spend a lot of money and energy creating crap candles for homeless hands as though you think you're doing your part in the world. And we gotta, Julia writes, there was a Christian-based housing development up north. I was chosen to get a home in with eight other families. I turned it down because it smelled badly. Spiritually. Turns out the townhomes were built on an undisclosed hazardous waste site. Jesus Christ. They thought I was uppity and ungrateful until the truth came out.
Yeah. Well, Julia, if you just put some of those tuna candles around the house, it would have been fine.
That tuna smell would have knocked out the smell of toxicity. There's this other thing, this idea that people should just be grateful for what they get.
Yeah.
It's like tied in with our myths of meritocracy, as though I've always been confused by this. To me, if you're serving people as though they're Christ, or even if you're serving people as though you're Christ, you should give people the best stuff. So these ideas of broken, rickety old futons being given to that's never made sense to me. Even when evangelical days.
Yeah. Or neighborhood food drives, and everybody goes and they get like the worst crap cans out of the back of their pantry that they're never going to eat, and they're like, "Oh, isn't that great? I gave away." Yeah, and this happens on small and big scales too, right? Right now, Jeff Bezos's ex-wife is getting all these kudos for giving $1 billion to historically Black colleges. And, people who have done analyses of these billionaires, they've got this billionaire pledge, like, I'm going to give away all my wealth, blah, blah, blah. The net worth of these people never goes down. It never goes down. Because they're so locked into all these investments that are making more and more money. So the system is not shifting at all, and that's that's why Jesus got killed, because Jesus fucked with the system. I mean, that was the issue. He goes along and he sees all of these power dynamics, and he sees all of these pressure points, and he disrupts by actually doing things.
Finger into the middle of the issue.
And that, it's suddenly like, wait a minute, we don't need to have a leper colony because we can touch them and they can hang out with us. And, now you've upended the entire system. And so that becomes the real challenge, is not how do you just do the things that the system allows you to do to make yourself look good, but how do you really start building another way of functioning?
Ellen writes, reading Bruchko. I read that book like 3 or 4 times. It's a story about this missionary kid, Bruce Olson. I think he was 19. Decided, I'm just going to be a missionary, and wanders there, just like that young woman who murdered 105 kids accidentally. But this time he learned and was a little bit more in solidarity, but it was still so many thousands of kids read about Bruce Olson and thought, I'm going to be a missionary too, because that's the most important thing. So it's one of the first steps in expanding this idea of who God is and uncovering some of the myths of evangelical missions. So my understanding, you can add more, Ellen, but so Bruce Olson ended up kind of working in solidarity with some of the tribes there to protect them from government incursion. And it exposed how much of these mission organizations are in bed with different government forces all the time for political things. Like we read about this now, you hear about Rick Warren knowing pastors in a country that are trying to pass laws that make it illegal to be homosexual. And then you see how some of the funds from there working with evangelical organizations is being lobbied back to the United States government in order to support different initiatives over there. Like this sort of stuff happens all the time. And it's toxic. And again, we don't talk about it much because there's something sacred about the Great Commission. A good counter story here. Maria writes, my great-grandfather was an itinerant minister and eventually bishop in the Free Methodist Church. My family tell me that they didn't even own most of the furniture in the parsonage. They raised some of their own food, and of course, there were no pensions. The situation for most pastors today is much different.
Yeah, for a lot of pastors, it's actually not tremendously different. And this story is a great example of how, for many of these churches, and particularly in mainline denominations, the pastor almost becomes like the sacrificial lamb for our, Christian lifestyle, right? So the pastor is supposed to accept a below living wage, live in a crappy manse that they don't really take care of. Even as pensions have developed in the churches, they're often pretty meager. Meanwhile, everybody else in the church, all the members, are supposed to live the happy capitalist existence and not have their salary or anything questioned. One of the things I said once in the church in Crooks, and I said, it'd be great, like when we're talking about my salary and pastor's salary, is that we should paste everybody's salary on the wall of the sanctuary, and we should all have a conversation about salaries and about all of our salaries. And that made everybody very nervous.
No,
we didn't do that.
I mean, this is the flip side of it. Like, it's easy to talk about how exploitative Christianity is and how many ministers just make too much money. But I was a part of a rural congregation where I was on the board as a teenager because they wanted to have a youth representative on the board, which I don't think was a good idea. But so I was on this church board, and we had a conversation about how much the pastor should get paid. And everyone's sense was that the pastor should be paid kind of on the low end of what the average wage for the church was. And so it was generally understood that he had to get paid less than a first-year school teacher, which I still to this day am messed up by that. Like, I still think that if I could make what a school teacher makes, I'd be sitting pretty, and I feel guilt over almost any money I make because I'm in ministry. So but that's still it's the other side of the same coin. There's this idea, this whole idea of how money in Christianity works is that people should be sacrificed for the cause of Christ. And so if you're either a pastor sacrificing people for the cause of Christ, or you're a sacrificed pastor for the cause. Like, it's just this sort of twisted capitalist martyrdom thing that's tied in. It's always been part of this. It's toxic as hell. Ed writes, you go down to be taught rather than to teach, especially the indigenous. Yeah, especially if it's good learning, because I see a lot of that sort of condescending. I mean, I see it a lot. The condescending, oh, we are the ones who learned here. Yeah. Now, there is actual real learning to be had. And so I think there are groups that actually learn and develop humility in relationship to others. But
yeah, and it's the power dynamics are very insidious there too. but anyway, we're getting towards the end, so I want to roll through the comments.
Oh my God, yeah, lost track of time.
Yeah.
This has been a good two-parter, and we're still. Series writes, and how do we get real with the fact that much of our friendships, romantic relationships, neighbors, and family relationships operate like charity models as well, which explains a relational dysfunction. We were talking about that a little bit earlier, and yes, I mean this is part of the insidious problem, and it's partly why I think so many people want to operate in denial about these economic and power imbalances, because really they're everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, we're taught that all of life is transactional, and so then that infects everything.
Julie writes, toxic waste is too often donated to tax breaks and the cheap disposal of polluted goods or land. Yeah, let's get rid of our crap.
Yeah.
I still have a bunch of donated crap in our basement that was given to help homeless people.
God!
Like
every church is full of donated crap. It's just amazing.
And the people feel so proud of themselves when they give us their crap.
I know.
And I just take it because I don't want them to feel bad.
That's just because you're Minnesotan.
Yeah, well, there's probably some internalized trauma there too. Ellen writes, what I don't get is how conservatives don't get that their policies cause the problems they're thinking they'll go save the people from. It's a perfect racket.
Yeah, that's and and this is and this is why the spiritual life and self-reflection is so important, because we need to interrogate our own mythology and our own ego structure, and that's the only way we can see these things.
Chester was anticipating our response, basically echoing
liberals. Yes. Yeah. Well, it's this is what ego does, is self-aggrandizement and creating a mythology where you're the good center of the universe.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't really matter whether you're liberal or conservative or a Martian.
I've never met. That's the next great mission field. Patricia writes, problem for white folks in churches exist with the need to always be leading and in leadership. Yeah. To use their gifts instead of being useful in service. That's a hard one. I mean, to me, that takes a lot of self-reflection and vigilance, and I'm totally shaped by that. Ellen and Chester are in agreement. In the United States, so-called liberals are conservative. Yeah, there's all the semantics here, but even if we had a tradition, to me, the capitalist mode is fraught with this, and so to me, liberals and conservatives are two branches from the same trunk. Series writes, I think there's a lot of Judas Iscariot's attitude on giving resources and charity. That is from the story where the woman gave Jesus perfume, and Judas barked at her for giving high quality perfume, saying that all the money from the perfume should go to the poor. Yes, there's like a stinginess and a judging of merit that happens. Gus writes, when you're talking about giving the best and whatnot, we should also say that it's not enough to just give the best things, because we are assuming that we know what is actually needed without actually asking the people directly impacted.
Yeah,
that's right.
I mean, ultimately, and this is the thing about the traveling to be educated, where I think we have to be a little careful, is that this gets back to the power piece. I mean, to me, if you're talking about any group of folks who need something, right, and this is the whole conversation that's going on now around policing of Black folks, and you've got all these white people that are making decisions about what is best for them, doesn't it seem obvious that actually the Black folks should be saying what they need in terms of policing? And so it's whether we're talking about homelessness or indigenous folks or people in another country, shouldn't we be asking them what they want? Like, maybe they don't want to see our faces. Like, maybe they just are like, what we really need is for you to leave us alone. Like, that's what we need. Yeah. And then we'd be just like, well, but oh my God, we want to come and learn from you. It's like, we don't care. We want to be left alone. and we don't want to hear really what they really need and want and think about it.
And that means just not going to find people who share your opinion and asking those Black people, like, which is the other piece, is selective mutuality. The other piece about the giving the best and asking what they want, there's this tyranny and expectation that comes with gifts, which is anyone who's been a fundraiser or worked in a church, like you get somebody who thinks they're doing you a gigantic favor and it's not that great of a favor, and then you feel like indebted to them. And it's weird. Like I have a friend who works in food shelves and they get stuff like foie gras donated to them, which is not going to be great for their soup line. Becca writes, I'm noticing that outreach, mission, evangelism, and fundraising are discussed in my local church like they're the same thing. Interesting. Good observation. And the local church starts talking about mission, outreach, evangelism when the budget is in the red. Discipleship seems to be a separate conversation, though. That's interesting. David writes, Gus, it's giving the best, informed with the platinum rule of treating others as they want to be treated. Love it. Julia's co-signing with Ceres and Ellen. And then Steve is laughing and crying from the retired pastor.
Right.
The pain is real. Leah writes, we don't trust those we have power over to make their own decisions.
Yeah, because that gives them power.
Yeah, then we don't have power over them anymore. Julia writes, white Christian supremacy says, we know what you need and let me remake you in the image of myself.
Nope.
Mama always said, not all money is good money and neither are all gifts.
And there we go. That's it.
Once again, tremendous comments today. Lots of rich conversation, heavy stuff. And to me, I'm left with the question that Ceres asked, like, okay, what does this look like? How do we recenter this on mutuality? And to me, that's the big question. And I don't think there's a clean answer to that because I think it's a discernment issue. And it comes from we have to continue. I know this makes people think you're negative when you do this, but you have to keep problematizing all of this and make people feel uncomfortable until we start actually doing deep and real and honest discernment that is free from platitudes. Shen gets the final word, I think, here. I'm thinking about the need to be needed that exists in codependent relationships, which lead to an inherent power imbalance.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so problematize and do our spiritual practice.
Yep, and that's the beginning.
Into the unknown. All right, thanks, everybody.
I'll see y'all tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.